All right. You guys see everything fine?
Yeah, and also
All
can
right,
hear.
cool. Well, let's get started. So I'm Corey. I'm going to be doing Sitecore and MVC A to Z. A little bit about me first. I'm a 2017 Sitecore MVP of Technology. Really excited about that. It's a great opportunity. I'm also a lead technical consultant at Perficient. Perficient, we're an IT consulting company in North America. I've been working here for about 5 years. For my first 3 or so years, I did custom .NET development, and for the past couple, I've been doing exclusively Sitecore, and it's been really awesome. You can find me on Twitter anytime at Sitecore. Please send me a message. And my blog is also coreysmith.co. So let's get started. MVC. This is a pretty deep topic. Hopefully, all of you doing Sitecore work today are using MVC and not using web forms. But if you are doing MVC, you might be focused on just doing controller renderings or view renderings in the applications that you're developing. So if you're doing just controller renderings, you're only seeing a very small portion of the MVC framework. You're just seeing the view and the controller and the model. But around the MVC, before your controller gets instantiated, or after your view gets instantiated, there's a lot of stuff that the framework's doing, a lot of magic to make all that stuff happen. For example, whenever you write a controller, right, you're just writing a class, but you're never actually instantiating it. So how is that happening? Well, that's where MVC comes into play. That's where controller factories happen. Right, whenever you return a view result, how is that actually getting written to the response? So what I want to do today is I want to talk about some of those parts around MVC, some of the deeper parts of the MVC framework, and maybe show how you can use them on your projects. And going forward, I hope that whenever you're addressing an issue in MVC or in your projects, that you think about some of the things that I talk about today, and can go, look on Google and look up view engines, or look up action filters, or look at how to work with routes to write cleaner code in your projects. So we're going to get started first, talking about the routing engine. So routing, this is the entry point into your MVC application. Routing has one single purpose, and that's mapping a URL to a controller and an action. So out of the box, Sitecore comes with one route that applies to all of Sitecore's controllers, but it also applies to all of your controllers. And that route takes this form, /API/Sitecore, and then it's got two templates, controller and action, where your controller and action name can be replaced. So if you've got, for example, a carousel controller with a carousel item action, you can use this today. Right, there's no extra configuration you have to do. So from jQuery, you can actually, or like your Angular or React, you can actually hit your controllers like this. But probably you don't want to use this. Maybe you want some better branding for your company, like company name API/controller/action. And it's very easy for you to add more routes into the MVC framework. So the way you would do that in Sitecore is just register a pipeline processor and add that into the initialize pipeline. So there are really two places that you could put your processor. You could put it either before this initialize routes processor that Sitecore has out of the box, or after. Where you put your processor is very important. If you put it before initialize routes, whenever your route is hit from outside, then Sitecore is going to make sure that the MVC begin request and MVC end request pipelines execute. If you register your processor after this processor, that won't happen. So a safe bet is to always register your routes, your route processor before this one. But if you know without a doubt that you don't need that MVC begin request or end request pipeline to execute, then you can maybe get a very small performance increase by registering after initialize routes. So like I said, you just do this by writing a pipeline processor, and it's pretty easy. The big thing that you want to do is you want to modify this route table routes property. And this is a static property that actually is shared between the MVC framework and the Web API framework. So if you've done any work with Web API, usually you add your routes to the global configuration, but actually it's just going to end up getting written to this, this global property right here as well. So that's shared between both of those. And it's pretty simple, right? Like I've just got a little method here, register routes, and this is going to take the route table. And then there's a method map route where you provide a name, a URL template, and some defaults for that URL template. So let's jump over here and look. I've got some examples of what some valid URLs are for this. So the first valid URL you could use is just /myroute, right? That's defined here. And if you do that, then what MVC is going to do is it's going to look at the defaults you provide for that route, right? So in that case, you didn't specify a controller action, so MVC is going to just default to the carousel controller. It's going to default to the carousel item action, and it's not going to provide anything for the ID because you said that's optional. And so on and so forth down the line. But if you get down here to where we're actually providing the ID, this is where it gets interesting. So if you provide that ID, the big question is, well, how do you access it? Well, in your action, you can actually just specify that in the action parameters. So you can see here that I've specified a nullable int, and that's ID, which corresponds to this ID parameter template here, right? So MVC is actually going to, whenever instantiating this action, is going to say, oh, okay, well, in this segment of the URL, there's a 5. That corresponds to the ID segment. He's asking for an int, so let me supply this as an int. It'll do all the casting for you, and that's pretty nice. URL parameter.optional here. If there was like a default value you wanted to supply, like 1 or 2 or 0 or whatever, you could do that as well. And you're not limited to just these tokens. If you can make my variable name or whatever you want, any token is valid here. So yeah. So like I said, Sitecore, they have one route that's applied to the entire application, your controllers and Sitecore's controllers out of the box. So whenever you add your own route, that's fine. One controller action can actually be accessed from many routes. But the big question you might ask after adding multiple routes into your application is, how do I know that my route's been called versus the Sitecore route? And that's, again, where we're going to go back to the route defaults object. So you can see here, in this route, I've specified a Boolean, my route equals true. And this is only going to be present for this route that I've specified. You know, Sitecore, their routes aren't going to have my route equals false, for example. It's only going to be here. So then whenever I go and have my controller action run, I can just specify an action parameter, my route, as a Boolean, and this will get populated in from the defaults. You can notice that's not getting specified in either of these URLs. It's just coming straight from the defaults. And action parameters in the model binding system is certainly one way to get that data, but it's not the only way, right? If you spend any time doing MVC, you know that there are multiple ways that you can access data and do things. And so another way would just be to go and look at the request object on the controller, the request context, and then there's actually a route data dictionary that you can look into and see if it contains that key. Now you notice that I'm not actually casting this route data to a Boolean, right? It's not necessary. Like I said, there's not going to be any other route in the system that's going to say my route equals false. So just the presence of this key in the dictionary is enough to know that my route's been called. Another thing that I want to point out is that controllers in MVC, they have a lot of convenience properties that you might not be aware of. And I would suggest that whenever you're working in controllers in MVC and views even, views have a lot of really good convenience properties as well, to just type this dot and then see what IntelliSense exposes to you, right? I mean, it's perfectly valid for you to come in here and write HTTP context.current.request.request context.route data and find out if the route data contains your key that way. But this is a lot simpler. It's a lot cleaner code. Not to mention, whenever you want to go and unit test this controller, this is going to be a lot easier to unit test this line right here than this one is, because you can imagine if you want to unit test this line of code, you're going to have to mock the request object, you're going to have to mock the request context, and you're going to have to mock the route data dictionary. Whereas with this one, all you have to do is mock the route data dictionary that's on the controller. Now, one other thing that I'll say is that although this my route, this looks like the simpler way to go, there's one caveat, and I'm going to get into depth a little bit about this later, but you can actually provide a false value to this, because action parameters come from several places. They really just bind to the request. So you could actually like come up here and say, you know, question mark my route equals true, and force this value to true from the outside, even if this route's not been called. So if you absolutely want to be sure that your route's been called, route data is the best way to go to check that. So we're working in Sitecore, and another big question that we're going to ask is, well, when is Sitecore calling my controller, right? How can I know that my controller is being called from a controller rendering versus being called externally, like you know, through jQuery or JavaScript from the client? Well, that's where Sitecore has actually done something really nice for us. Whenever they call our controllers through a controller rendering, they're always going to put this key in the route data. SC is fall through. So if you see this in the route data dictionary, you know your controller has been called through Sitecore. And I've just kind of written some sample code here. You know, by no means is this maybe the best or the only way to approach this problem, but you can imagine that if you want your rendering to be able to be rendered server side by a Sitecore rendering, or also be rendered through some templating engine in JavaScript, you're going to have some slightly different logic, because whenever Sitecore renders your controller rendering, there's going to be a data source present, right? But whenever you call from the browser, there's not. So in this case, what I'm doing is I've just provided a simple action parameter carousel ID. And what I'm doing in this method is just basically saying, hey, if Sitecore is calling my controller, then I want to return the markup for the current data source carousel item. But if this is getting called outside, like through JavaScript, then let's just get the database item specified in the carousel ID query string, for example. So we've talked a bit about routing and how this really gets your application started. Routing is going to figure out which controller and action need to execute, but what's next? So after the routing system has figured that information out, the controller factory is kind of the next thing in the MVC pipeline that's going to kick off, and that's actually going to be responsible for building your controllers. And then once your controller is built, the next thing is another facility in MVC called the action invoker that's actually going to be responsible for using that route data to find which action needs to execute. But before that action invoker actually executes your action, it's going to run what are called filters. And so that brings us into the next section, filtering in MVC. So filtering in MVC is probably, in my opinion, one of the coolest facilities that MVC has. I think there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of really neat things you can do here. Filtering in MVC is all about cross-cutting concerns. So what are cross-cutting concerns? That's things that might apply to a lot of actions or a lot of methods in your application, for example, but it's code that doesn't necessarily belong in each of those actions. So consider like logging or caching, exception handling, those kind of things. And if you think about it, like, let's go to a performance testing example. If you want to performance test all of your actions in MVC, say you've got hundreds of action methods. Well, one approach that you could certainly take is go into each one of your actions, and on the very first line, start a new stopwatch. On the last line, stop that stopwatch. and then write to some, logging file or whatever, how long it took that action to execute. But if you think about it, that logging logic doesn't belong in your controller actions, right? Like if you've got a controller action that's all about getting a user, that controller action should do one thing and one thing well, and that's get a user and return some HTML or some JSON for it. So that logging behavior really belongs somewhere else, and that's where filtering comes into play. MVC provides some base classes that you can use to really encapsulate that cross-cutting concern code. And there are several types of filters in MVC. They are going to execute in this order, right? So the first kind of filter that's going to execute is an authentication filter, which is focused on making sure that you're logged into the system, right? That's all it does. Are you logged in or not? Who are you? Then once the authentication filters have executed, the next will be the authorization filters, which make sure that you have access to do something. And then after authorization filters that are executed, then will be the action filters and result filters. And at any point, exception filters can actually execute, right? You can think about exception filters as really writing a big try-catch around your controller actions. And these filters can be registered in 3 places. They could be registered globally. So if you register one of these filters globally, they're going to apply to every action in your system. Or you could apply them to a controller to apply to all of the controller's actions or to each action individually. I'm not going to talk about authentication filters. I think in Sitecore, that's probably not something that you're really going to leverage that much. Authorization filters are pretty interesting though. And again, these are going to execute after authentication filters have executed. So to make one of these, all you do is just create a class that subclasses this authorization attribute and then override this onAuthorizations method. These are going to execute before action filters, so they're really good for things like protocol validation. MVC comes with one attribute out of the box, require HTTPS attribute that you can put globally or on controllers or on actions to actually make sure, that somebody is hitting your action from an HTTPS URL. And if they're not, that action will, that authorization attribute will make sure that they're redirected to the HTTPS URL and that no further action code executes. Another good thing is input validation. So if you're using cross-site request forgery tokens in your app, in your views, to make sure that there's not malicious data coming into your application, this is another good thing, right? We want to make sure that if there's malicious data coming into our application, we don't want our actions to execute at all. So this is a good place for that. And lastly, authorization. Right? If you've got a controller action that's returning salary data, employees in your system shouldn't be able to see that. Only managers should. So authorization filters are a really good way to enforce that. And one thing to note whenever you're using this authorization attribute is that the filter won't actually execute if allow anonymous is present. So I kind of misspoke. Authorization attribute isn't actually the only way to make one of these authorization filters. This attribute inherits from an iAuthorizations filter interface. So if you want your authorization attributes to be resilient to this allow anonymous attribute, instead of subclassing authorization attribute, just implement the iAuthorizations filter interface and subclass filter, and then you don't have to worry about this. Now, one of the really cool things about authorization filters is that you can prevent further execution of action filters, other authorization filters, or actions by just setting this result property. So like if you know, for example, in your authorization filter that, hey, they didn't meet some requirement, let's go ahead and return a view to them, you can do that here. After your authorization filters have executed, the next thing in the pipeline will be action filters. These have a base class action filter attribute and 2 methods you can override, on action executing and on action executed. This is going to execute right before your action runs, and this one will execute right after. So similar to authorization filters, you've also got the opportunity in on action executing from preventing your action from executing at all just by setting this result property on the action executing context parameter in this method. And in on action executed, this is the first opportunity that you get in your application to manipulate the result from your action, right? So this is a good place to do things like override, just straight up change the result that came out of your actions, or maybe decorate it. And after your action executes, it's always going to return some kind of result, right? So whenever in your action you're doing like return view or return JSON or return content, that HTML or that JSON isn't being rendered at that point. That's actually returning a command to the MVC framework that says, hey, at some point in the future, I want you to render a view, or I want you to render some JSON back to the response. And before MVC actually does that, these result filters come into play. And so these result filters, you make them just like you make action filters by subclassing this action filter attribute, and you just provide an implementation for either one of these methods. So yes, you can actually have one attribute that implements all four action filter and result filter methods. And again, this is going to run, this on result executing is going to hit before your result executes, and this is going to hit after. So this is kind of good for things like modifying the response. This is your last chance, right? Once on result executed is executed, no more chances for you to modify the response that came out of your action. And it's also a good opportunity to do some kind of caching on your results. So I mentioned earlier that you can apply action filters and result filters in multiple different places. You can either apply them globally or down to the action. So that brings up the question, well, what order are they going to execute? And this is it. So for on action or result executing, they're going to execute from least specific to most specific. So global filter is going to execute first. Controller filter methods, I'll talk about these soon, but then they execute, and then any filters applied to your controller, and then any action filters. And then the executed methods, they apply in the opposite order. So they're going to execute from most specific to least specific. I want to talk a moment about best practices with filters. So controllers or filters, right? I mentioned in the last slide that there are controller filter actions. Controllers actually implement all of the filter interfaces. So on your controller, you can just go and do override on action executing or on authorization or whatever. So if you know that there's some cross-cutting code that only needs to apply to one controller, you don't have to go and write a separate class. You can just implement that directly on your controller. If you want to create a global filter in Sitecore, the best way to do that is as a pipeline processor, and MVC makes some pipelines for you that I've listed here where you could go and put those processors. However, I would highly suggest that you avoid global filters in Sitecore altogether. The reason being that if you register a global filter, those global filters aren't going to apply to just your controllers, they're going to run on Sitecore's controllers. So that means whenever you write a global filter and apply it to the application, your testable surface increases, right? Now you've got to go and test all of Sitecore's functionality and make sure that you haven't broken anything. So I would recommend that you should have all of your application controllers inherit from a base controller and apply the filters there. Then you get kind of the best of both worlds, right? Now you don't have to worry about breaking Sitecore, but you get that kind of implicit global functionality. So enough about action filters, at least talking about them. I'd like to take a minute now to do a demo for you guys. So I have got a sample application that I've made here, and it's just got a few controller renderings on it. It's got a nav bar, it's got a Jumbotron, it's just using Bootstrap. It's got a content tile. On the About page, I've got a simple carousel. And imagine that your client comes to you and says, hey, we want to start writing some of these components in Angular. We want to start writing them in React. Well, okay, that's possible, but you might duplicate code, right? I mean, if you're using Angular or using jQuery or whatever, now what you don't want is the HTML of this rendering. You want the view model of this rendering, right? So we hop over to Visual Studio, and my carousel controller, you can see I've got a carousel action, and I've just got some business logic in here to generate this carousel, right? Like, I'm not doing anything fancy, just going and getting the current data source, getting all of its children, and mapping all that stuff to a view model. So if you want to return JSON in some certain scenario, that's certainly possible. Like, you could just come in here and say, okay, you know, in my controller action, if the request dot accept types contains application/JSON, then instead of returning a view, return JSON view model. Is this big enough for you guys, or should I zoom in?
Corey, can you increase the size of your font?
How's that?
Thank you. Much better now.
Okay. Yeah, so like you can see here, I mean, one thing that I could do is just check if the accept types contains application JSON and return JSON, right? Like this will work fine. Now just my view model is going to get returned to the client. Yeah, and you could tell your client, hey, this is done, right? And then whenever they come in and ask for the same thing on the content tile, you could paste your code and be done there. But we know how clients are; their requirements are ever changing. So probably tomorrow they don't want to use this accept type header; they want to use a query string or something. So let's use action filters to do this instead. Like I said before, controllers are actually filters. So you can come in here to your controller, and you can just do on action executing. Get this right. On action executing. So let's think about this for a minute. We want to get the view model, right? Like we want this object, but we don't want the HTML from this view. So we want our action to execute. And therefore, on action executing is not a good place for us to put our code, right? So the best place, the first chance for us to get this view model and to access it would be in on action executed, right? We want this code to execute. So let's do that. And what we can do is we can actually get a reference to our view result just by coming to the filter context parameter and casting the result to a view result. Right now we've got a handle on this returned object. And what we want to do first is say, hey, if the cast fails, like if the view result is null, maybe they're already returning JSON, then just don't do anything. So now we've got a handle on this view that we're returning. And so now we need some way to grab this model. Well, that's easy too. You can just do var model equals view result and then pull the model out of it. It's there for you. And now for the last part is, okay, we've got our model, so now we just want to return JSON instead. So let's do that. We can just go to the filter context, and on the result, we can just do a new JSON result. And for this JSON result, we'll put our model as the data property, because that's what JSON results use. And then there's one thing that we've got to be careful of. MVC out of the box does not allow controller actions to return JSON for GET requests. It only allows JSON to be returned for posts, so we have to set the JSON request behavior to allow GET. All right, and we're done. That's all there is to it. So I'm going to publish this code, and now we expect for this carousel, because the carousel action is the one that I manipulated, we expect that whenever we refresh this page, everything else should render, but this carousel won't. It should be just straight JSON. So let's refresh. And we'll wait for Sitecore to start back up. And I'll go ahead and give you a spoiler and tell you that it's not going to. This isn't going to fail because I didn't make a sacrifice to the demo gods today. This actually has a good reason.
It happens all the time.
I know. I did make a sacrifice, I'll let you know. Yeah, so you can see that we're getting HTML back instead of the rendered page. But the good thing is that, hey, now we're not getting HTML back for our carousel, we're getting JSON. So why are we getting HTML back instead of JSON? Well, in a traditional MVC application, you only have one action executing per page. So this JSON result, whenever it executes, it's going to set the content type of the response to application JSON. On a traditional MVC application, that's fine. You probably expect that behavior, but as we know in Sitecore, we have potentially hundreds of controller actions executing for a page. So this isn't good behavior. Now, a view, on the other hand, this view result, it doesn't do anything to the content type. So now we need some way to prevent the content type being set to application JSON. So we can do that with result filters, right? We know that on result executing, this is our first and really our last chance to do anything with the result before it executes. So what we'll do is we'll just come in here and say on result executing, we'll just grab a handle on the current content type. So we'll just do filter context.http context .response .content type. And now we've got a reference to the current content type on the response before this JSON result executes. But now we need to stick it somewhere. Well, fortunately, the filter context has a reference to the controller. So this controller is going to live in your application until the response is actually returned to the client. So this is actually a safe place to put data. And the controller has a view bag property. This is a dynamic object where you can put anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stash the content type away on that view bag. Okay, now we want our JSON result to execute. Cool, we've got our JSON. And now we need to set that content type back, and that's easy. Now we can just go to on result executed, and let's grab the content type out of the controller. And let's set it back on the response. So if I've done everything correctly, on publish, we should see the page render. Fingers crossed. Let me see everyone's fingers. All right. Hey, I saw a peace sign out there. That's not doing me any good. I saw you. Okay, I'll take that. Hey, it worked. Thanks for everyone that crossed their fingers. Shame on you for doing peace sign. I'll never forget that. Okay. So yeah, we've got this carousel controller returning JSON now, but we know pesky clients, they always demand more. And whenever they see that Eduardo did this in 5 minutes, despite not crossing his fingers, that it's going to work fine, right? So yeah, how do we go and implement this elsewhere? Well, we can just go and move it to a filter like this. We can go and cut our code. And like in our infrastructure folder, for example, we can go and add a new action filter attribute. And just paste our code, because again, your controller implements the exact same interfaces. And what we're going to do is we're just going to change all these methods to public and get all of the right references. Thanks to ReSharper. Clean this up. And now, like I talked about earlier, whenever you have global filters in Sitecore, you don't want to, let's change this to JSON filter attribute. We'll call it that because it's going to return JSON and then inherit from action filter attribute here. So in your applications, you don't want to register filters globally in Sitecore just because there's a danger of breaking Sitecore. Like this filter right now is going to force every controller in Sitecore other than yours to return JSON, which is probably going to break, you know, the Sitecore desktop and other things. So a better way is like all my controllers are just inheriting from this base controller. So I can come in here and I can put my JSON filter on that and just click publish. And now this is going to apply to every action on every controller that inherits from base controllers. So this nav bar, for example, is a controller rendering. So now we expect when we go back to the home page that all of our controller rendering should return JSON. Let's see. Hey, it worked, right? So now our nav bar, it's coming back um, with an array of items, a URL and a URL label for each one of those items in the nav bar. All of our content tiles are coming back. So that was pretty simple, pretty easy code. This doesn't have any business being in your actions. This is a really powerful way to encapsulate that kind of cross-cutting concern logic. So let's go back. All right, so your action filters have executed, and now MVC is going to execute your action. But one of the most powerful parts of MVC, model binders, are going to be responsible for making sure that all of those action parameters get populated from the request. So the model binders, this is a very deep topic. I could probably talk, for a couple of hours about these alone, but we're just going to do kind of surface coverage of them. These model binders, they can bind both simple models or simple types like bool, char, int, string, and they can also bind complex models, so like a class that you make. And out of the box, model binders leverage what are called value providers to bind from the request, and they're going to bind from 4 key parts of the request: the query string, form data, request body, and route data. The route data I showed you earlier in the routing section. And so the model binders, they're really a great way to provide data to your controllers without direct dependencies. So there's a really good blog post. I can't remember who wrote it, but he actually demonstrated how he used a model binder to return glass models to all of his controller actions. And that was pretty sweet because then his controllers didn't have to inherit from glass controller anymore. So that's one way that you can kind of reduce dependencies in your controllers, which really just at the end of the day for you means easier and faster unit testing. So you don't have to mock things like the HTTP context. In your unit testing, you can just provide data for the action method. So like, for example, if we go back to the good old days of web forms, and in fact, on a lot of MVC projects that I work on, I still see this kind of code. If you had like a myInt property that you wanted to get from the query string, well, what you had to do is go to the request.queryString dictionary and then parse that to an int. But MVC, one of its powerful features, makes it so we don't have to do that anymore. And you can just, on your action, say, hey, I need an int, myInt, and then MVC is going to run out to the request and find that. It's going to find that string for you from the request and cast it into the appropriate type. So this kind of code is not really that complex, but if we go to something like this, where you've got a whole class that you want to bind, well, this is where it becomes really powerful and really nice to reduce boilerplate code in your applications, right? So if I've got a view model class that's got a my bool property and a my char property and my int and my string, well, my God, look at all the work I have to do to get that stuff out of the request. But actually, you don't have to do that at all in MVC. All you have to do is tell MVC that you want an action parameter of type my view model, and then MVC is going to run off to the request, and it's going to find all of these things for you. It's going to look in places other than the query string, right? Like if my bool comes from the route data, that's fine, and it's going to cast it to the appropriate type for all of these properties. So that's really, really cool. And there's a lot of other really cool stuff that you can do with them, but I really just wanted to hit on this because, like I said, I still see a lot of this code in projects today, and I just want to make sure that people are aware of this facility and the time and effort it can save you. Okay, so our actions have gotten their action parameters, and now they've returned most likely a view result or a partial view result. And once you've done that, probably the next thing that MVC is going to execute is a view engine. View engines are another really cool thing in MVC. They execute in one of 3 scenarios out of the box. They're going to run whenever you return a view result, a partial view result, or when you call html.partial from one of your views. And view engines, they do one thing, and they do one thing well, and that's finding views. That's all they do. View engines aren't concerned, or your view result isn't concerned with where your view live. That's what the view engine is supposed to do. So if you've got your views pre-compiled into your assemblies. There's a view engine for that. If you want to stick your views in a database for some reason, you can write a view engine for that. Or typically, if you've got them on the file system, you can do that too. And that's what MVC supports out of the box. And so these view engines really, they drive the view folder structure and conventions, right? So out of the box, all your views, if you're not hard coding view paths, all your views have to live in the views folder and then in a folder for the controller, and then the view has to be named after the action. Or you could also stick them in the shared folder and name the view after the action. Yeah, but you can customize this, and we'll talk about that in a second. However, I do want to say, don't hard code view paths. I see that in a lot of projects too. Yeah, you can if you want to maintain a lot of strings all over the place, but that really introduces tight coupling between your controllers and your views. And that's kind of one of the things that MVC tries to stop you from doing, right? MVC is all about loose coupling between things. It's all about separation of concerns. So I highly recommend that you let the view engines handle finding your views. Don't hard code view paths when possible, or unless you really need performance. There are some blog posts out there saying that you can get better performance by hard coding view paths, but I think that the overhead that you introduce to your developers by hard coding these is probably not worth it. So one other thing that I want to say about view engines is that they make it so that controller and model locations don't matter. Whenever I first started doing MVC, I quickly learned that if you don't put your views in the right folder, that your controller is not going to execute properly, right? You're going to get a nasty yellow screen of death. And so I kind of said, well, hey, you know, MVC is telling me I've got to have this controller and models folder, so I need my controllers and models to live there as well. But that's not true. Today, you can go and restructure your projects just like this, right? You can go and put your controller and your model code alongside your views. And this is a lot nicer, in my opinion. This is more Helix compliant, right? One of the big tenets of Helix is what changes together stays together. And this adheres to that principle. And you don't have to make any changes to this, right? You can just go and do this today. You can imagine, like, I'm on a project today where I've actually got hundreds of controllers in this controllers folder and hundreds of views in this views folder, and it's just a nightmare scrolling through the solution explorer, trying to find the view on the controller action that I'm modifying or whatever. So I highly recommend this, but you might tell me, well, hey, Corey, you know, I don't feel comfortable putting my code in a views folder. Well, I tell you, that's fine. Why don't you go put everything in a folder called components, and you can just write a simple view engine to do that. Well, then you say, well, how do I do that? Well, I'll tell you. You just make a very simple view engine like this. So in my sample code here, I've just got what's called a components folder convention view engine. It's a mouthful, but you just subclass the Razor view engine that MVC provides out of the box. And then in the constructor, you just make an array of your location formats, right? So I'm just saying, hey, my views now live under components, and now I'm going to put 1 squiggly 0. And what the view engine is going to do whenever it runs, it's going to replace 1 with the controller name and 0 with the action name. And then in the constructor, you just put that array on the view location formats and partial view location formats properties. Now, there's a little bit extra code you have to write if you're using areas, but that's not much more overhead. So how do you add this? Okay, well, just like with routing, there's a global collection, this view engines.engines. So if you want to add your view engine globally, you can do that, and you just put that in the initialize pipeline, and always add your view engine to the top of the collection. Now, again, just like I said with the filters, you probably don't want to do this if you can avoid it. So another approach would be to add it to a base controller. And so you can see, like here with this base controller, it actually has a view engine collection. Controller does out of the box. So what you want to do is you want to add it in the initialize method. You can't do this in the constructor because the view engine collection is not going to be initialized there. In the initialize method, override this, run base.initialize, and then add your view engine there. So like I said, where possible, make sure that you add your view engines to the base controller. However, if you want your view engines to execute for Sitecore view renderings or HTML.partial, you have to add them to the global view engine collection. Under the hood, Sitecore view renderings actually call HTML.partial. They never instantiate a controller. This isn't true for glass views, I think, but for Sitecore, I know that there is no controller under the hood. So again, if you want support from those, you have to add to the global view engines collection. But another thing I want to say is favor more focused view engines rather than fewer view engines that are monolithic. So if we go back to this controller conventions view engine or components folder convention view engine, you can imagine that maybe in your application you wanted to have several different locations for views. Maybe you wanted to have a controller renderings folder and a view renderings folder, and that's fine. But I would recommend that instead of making an application convention view engine and sticking all of those location formats in that view engine, have several different view engines that are really focused on finding them in one spot, right? So have one for components, have a separate view engine for your controller renderings, and one for your view engine or your view renderings if that's what you want to do. Okay, so that's view renderings. The last thing I want to talk about today is reference source. So in the past couple of years, we all know that Sitecore or Microsoft has made a really, really big push to open source with .NET Core, but they didn't stop there. They've actually released the entire .NET framework on the web as well. So you can go to aspnetwebstack.coplex.com and you can get an entire solution that has all of the .NET ASP.NET framework. So if you're curious, just want to see how it all works, or confused or stuck on something, you can go download that code, compile it, and step through it yourself. I think whenever I first heard about it, I thought, God, this code must be really, really confusing and convoluted, but it's actually extremely clean and readable. It's very well commented. It's really approachable. I highly recommend everybody go take a look at this if you're using MVC or Web API today. And when you go and clone this, it's as simple as in that solution, just adding a new MVC project. Now, one thing I'll say is whenever you add a new MVC or Web API project to a solution out of the box, it's going to reference like the .NET Framework assemblies and the GAC. You'll have to change those references to actually reference the projects in the solution. But once you do that, you just set some breakpoints and learn. Like I've done this for a couple of things, like ran into some weirdness with model binding and Web API, and I solved it all just by downloading this code and running it. Yep, so that's all I've got. Turn over to questions and answers if you guys have any.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions online.
Oh no. Oh no.
You as well. Congratulations. Great stuff here.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to the questions. I'm scrolling up.
Oh no, I haven't even looked at the chat. Let's see.
I'm scaring him.
Yeah.
All right, so first question. At what scenarios your controller will be called by anything else than Sitecore? Please give us some practical examples.
Yeah, give me just 1 second. I'm trying to
turn on your webcam.
Yeah, get my webcam back on to talk to you guys.
Cool. There you are.
Yep. Hello. And let me see if I can get the YouTube up to read your questions. Just 1 second.
Okay, the first question were typed at 8:09. For you, 7:09. It was, at what scenarios your controller would be called by anything else than Sitecore? Please give us some practical examples.
Yeah, so a practical example would be, again, like I showed in that one demo, where maybe you want to be able to return HTML to jQuery, right? So if you've got like a carousel item that you want to make the carousel responsive, well, maybe instead of having Sitecore render each carousel item, you might have JavaScript call into your controller and get it that way. Right, so that would be just you going like in JavaScript and doing an AJAX request to /Sitecore/API/carousel/carousel item, right? And then that's actually going to go and execute your action method, and it's going to return the HTML directly back to JavaScript. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess so. So you're going to use the same component to either to the two things, to render something in the website and return the data, the same data in a different format.
Exactly. You got it.
All right. So next one, how to call the item rendering from controller action. This is from Anton. Example, Sitecore site have few regions as items and other items that are shared between regions. I'm not sure if that was clear enough. Want me to
Yeah,
repeat?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. Like, are you talking about like instead of using a controller or view rendering, using an item rendering?
I don't know. How to call it?
I'm gonna assume he is, and my answer is going to be unfortunately I don't know. I haven't worked with item renderings at all. If you could clarify in chat a little bit though.
Yeah, Anton, if you're on the line, if that satisfy your question or not, let us know, please, in the chat window.
Yeah, Anton, if you're in chat, I would love to hear about some good use cases for item renderings. I've heard about them. I've never used them personally, but they sound like a pretty cool and powerful thing to use in Sitecore.
Cool.
Maybe
Okay,
he dropped.
next one. João at our room is asking. We know already that Sitecore is going to migrate to .NET Core, and what are the expected improvements for the sake of MVC, of course, expected after that migration?
So it's hard to speculate on what Sitecore is going to do. I mean, the .NET Core change is going to be huge. I think that rewriting all of Sitecore onto ASP.NET Core is going to be a really big job. But with that being said, I think largely MVC is not going to change. The biggest change that I've seen from working with MVC and .NET Core just on personal play projects is that instead of having separate assemblies for MVC and Web API, now Web API and MVC are collapsed into one. It's all one big project, right? There's no distinction between the two. So I think you're going to get a lot more powerful like REST functionality from your controllers. The code's going to be a little bit cleaner. There's going to be more configuration that you can do than today, which is kind of hard to believe, but it's true. But yeah, like I said, it's hard to comment on what Sitecore is going to do. I mean, you know, their usage of .NET Core MVC could be totally different than what we see today. So, does that answer your question? Yeah.
This is Anderson from the room. I would
Hey.
like to know if any of the on the MVC pipeline, if there's anything attached to the IIS pipeline as well, because if there is, it might be an issue on this topic of conversion to the .NET Core.
Yeah.
If there's anything that is attached to the IIS pipeline on the MVC pipeline, that could be an issue as .NET Core is totally independent from IIS.
Well, Sitecore is implemented in the IIS pipeline, right? Like Sitecore itself, that the Sitecore begin request pipeline, that's run through an HTTP module. Yeah, so I'm not sure what they're going to do. It's going to be interesting to see that play out. But I mean, the heart of Sitecore at the end of the day is run through the IIS pipeline. There's a Sitecore Nexus DLL that's actually implementing an HTTP module that executes on every request to make sure that begin request and the end request pipelines execute. So I don't know. It's hard to say what they're going to do. I'm excited as you are to see that.
We're all excited and also a bit scared sometimes. All right. Next question. Magda Fidalgo from our friend from Sanofi, São Paulo is asking when to choose between web forms and MVC.
That answer is very easy. Always choose MVC, never choose web forms, right? As was mentioned in the chat, web forms is not future-proof, right? Like Sitecore, I'm sure that at some point, I don't know when it's going to happen, but at some point, Sitecore is going to totally drop support for web forms. So today, yeah, don't use web forms at all. If you're starting a new project, use MVC.
Yeah, we had a chance in New Orleans to see some folks at Sitecore and their expression of relief when they announced that they are leaving web forms.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll be relieved as well.
All right. Anything else? Let me see. You mentioned unit tests a lot during this presentation, and I personally never saw a Sitecore project with unit tests being used at the same way or the same amount of times than in a normal traditional .NET application. So could you please, I know it's off topic, but could you please elaborate on how often, how deep, and how much unit tests with Sitecore are you doing recently?
Yeah, so how much unit testing should you be doing? I think it's unfortunate, you know, I'll be the first to admit that I don't see unit testing as much as I'd like on projects. But anytime that you write your own business logic, you should be writing unit tests, period. Right? Like Dan Solivay, if he's out there listening, I'm sure that he's fist pumping right now. But any time that you have any kind of business logic, you should be unit testing, right? So all of those controller examples I showed, anytime that you're writing your own controller, you should be unit testing that controller. And that's one of the reasons that we use MVC, is that MVC makes it really easy to unit test those controllers, right? Through the things like model binding and the action parameters and those other facilities, dependency injection, those make unit testing a lot easier with MVC, whereas with web forms, although it was possible, it was a pain. So I guess my short answer is, if you're writing any code, you should be unit testing that, right? And you should be writing the code in a way that it is unit testable.
Great advice. Are you doing that yourself?
No comment.
Okay. Yeah, my personal experience is that it's harder to, of course, it's harder to do unit tests with Sitecore, as harder it is to mock data in Sitecore.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I haven't seen that much recently in the past.
Well, in my defense, all of my work has been on Sitecore 8.1. Like I'm just now getting onto projects with Sitecore 8.2, which introduced dependency injection across the board, right? Like that's available to you in your pipeline processors now. So I think in Sitecore 8.2, you don't really have an excuse. If you're writing any code, pipeline processors, or anything, you can unit testing. But I mean, in fact, not in my defense, even on Sitecore 8.1, you could still write all of your code in a way that was unit testable, right? Like, it's probably not the best practice to just call Sitecore APIs directly. You should be writing wrappers around the Sitecore API. And if you write wrappers, then that's going to be mockable. So yeah, I mean, maybe it's a little bit more challenging in some places. Do I sympathize with those who don't write unit tests? Yes, but is that really a good excuse? No, probably not. And especially not with Sitecore 8.2.
Cool. Chris Williams is saying that Sitecore Habitat Netcore is available on Git. We'll give you an idea of what worked and what doesn't. Of course, you have to see it by yourself. Yeah.
Really?
Hey Corey, Diego here. Is your demo, like the demo that you just presented today, available on Git or something like that?
It's not right now, but I can make it available there if you like.
Well, thinking on the community, maybe someone want to take a look. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. The only requirement I have is that Rodrigo bring me some of that cheesy bread he showed earlier.
Yeah. Have these.
Yeah, I'd be happy to throw that up on GitHub for you.
And by the way, I am splitting down these YouTube videos into 2 YouTube videos with 2 separated presentations, and we will attach anything to those 2 videos later, okay?
Okay.
Anything
Yeah,
else?
so Chris just messaged me and he gave this link for the Habitat.NET Core, which YouTube will not let me put in the link, but yeah, I can share that with you later, Rodrigo, if that's something you want to look at. That's kind of interesting. I didn't know that there was a project showing Habitat on .NET Core. That's impressive.
Yeah, for you that are seeing this video in the future, the thing will be in the description down here.
Okay, yep, so I'll send that to you for that.
Okay,
Okay, so Anton, it looks like he's being active. So he's saying they have region items and sub items. You want to read the question or the follow-up, Rodrigo?
go ahead.
So what Anton's saying is, for example, we have region items like English or French and sub items under them, but we also have other items that should be shared between regions. They are located outside of region tree under data folder. This items have Sitecore presentation. They should be accessible from paths en/item1 or fr/item1, etc. How to create routing plus controller that will call Sitecore route rendering engine for item 1, item 2. Well, how to create routing. So is this something that item renderings solve in Sitecore?
You're asking me?
No, I'm asking Anton. Yeah, maybe he's typing. Anton, if you want, direct message me on Twitter or whatever. We can talk about this. It's kind of an in-depth question, I think. Yeah.
Anything else here in the room?
Just a last question here, just out
Sure.
of curiosity. On the routing, I remember there are some tokens you can use: controller and action and ID.
Yeah.
Are there any others? You said you can create your own.
Yeah, absolutely.
How would the code identify? Like I'm assuming controller somewhere is codified somewhere to identify a class, and the action a method, and the ID a parameter, right?
Yeah. So can you guys see my screen again?
Yeah.
So if we, for example, like make a new pipeline processor. So it's all about this route table.routes, right? Or route table.tables. This is where routes, this is where all that action happens. So you just want to use this map route method. And then this map route, it takes several parameters. Like I said before, one of the ones that you always have to put is name. So we can just put my route. And then, okay, so the next one would be URL. And you can put whatever you want. So like, again, like I said, my route. And then if for example, you wanted this route to apply only to one controller and one action, you could put anything you want here. Right, MVC doesn't care. And then you're gonna have to provide some defaults. Messing up the syntax here. So say we wanted this always to go to my carousel controller, and we always wanted this go to my carousel action. Okay. Like this my route available is here. If I know that my carousel action is always going to get hit by this, then on my carousel controller, I can just come in here and say, like, I want this to be an integer. Then if I do that, then this is just going to automatically get populated, right? Like there's a direct mapping in the controller action parameters to this token name. So, I mean, in fact, like I'm pretty sure I've not tested this, but I'm pretty sure that you could come in here and just say string controller, and this will automatically get populated with the controller name. Or if you do string action, this is automatically going to get populated with the action name. So again, these tokens don't matter. You can put whatever you want here. And well, yeah, you're probably going to use this through model binding in your action parameters. So you just reference it here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
And like I said, I mean, I think one of the coolest things is just the fact that like you don't even have to declare a token right here. You can say my favorite variable equals, and you can even do a new object, like you can do a new object here, right? Like you're not limited to just simple types. You can actually put a whole object. So if I, for example, have a class that's got, I don't know, an integer on it, like you can put a whole class here. And then in your controller, then you can just say like, what did I call it? My class and my favorite variable. And this will get populated from the route data. And again, you can see this isn't a token. It's just this defaults is going to put that in the route data, and I think that's like a really cool thing. Probably not going to use it every day, but it's a good thing to know about. That makes sense?
Yeah. Do you want to give a second chance to Anton?
I'll give Anton as many chances as he wants tonight. That's fine. Let's see. Okay. I'll give it to you, Rodrigo. You've got such a nice voice.
Come on. Yeah, I'm honestly don't understand what he's trying to say, but I guess Edipo, he's more. Do you understand, Edipo? Do you want to summarize for us? Basically, on his example, he used the .NET MVC web application pattern, but it's a good question if you understood. I don't understand that. Oh yeah, good one, Anton. Please, we are not being able to understand exactly what you're saying. So maybe you can post this on Stack Overflow,
or
Stack Exchange or Slack or anything. Then we can get deeper on this. All right.
I mean, if you guys are just talking about multi-language, I don't think that that's actually routing. I think that's Sitecore's item resolution, and those are two very different things.
Exactly.
I mean, if you're talking about how Sitecore lets you, specify, hey, English and hey, French and Japanese or Portuguese, right? And it's gonna put those language codes in the URL. It looks like routing. It's Sitecore's version of routing, and that's all happening through the item resolver. So that's not actually MVC routing happening there.
Indeed, that's the main call to the page, and
right.
Then that Sitecore will call every single action or controller for component from there.
Right. So I mean, in the HTTP begin request pipeline, I think that Sitecore is going to it actually checks MVC routes before it goes to the item resolver. So I mean, if you wanted to register a route that takes that form, you can. If Sitecore or if MVC finds a match for the URL in the routing table, then the item resolver will never execute. Actually, Sitecore will abort the whole pipeline because it'll say, hey, I found a match in the routing table that matches this URL. Let's not even proceed with item resolution or anything like that. Let's just hand it over to MVC. I think that's what he's asking.
Yeah, it's a good interpretation. Anton, if that's enough, let us know. Otherwise, please place that question anywhere on the networks, and spread to the community. We will try to do our best. I guess we are good. Anything else here in the room? No? Good stuff, buddy. You are the man.
Hey, can I get a finger cross?
Corey.